I'm really excited about the guest that I had conversation with for this podcast. His name is Professor Daniel Rynhold. Professor Rynhold is Dean and Professor of Jewish Philosophy at the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies at Yeshiva University. Dr. Rynhold is also a former teacher of mine. About 20 years ago, I was doing a graduate program at University College London. The way it works in University College London is as long as you are a student at University of London, you can take classes in the University of London system. I wanted to study philosophy and Jewish philosophy in particular, and I found that there was a course offered in medieval Jewish philosophy at King's College London, and I decided to take that course, and the teacher was Professor Rynhold. It seems like in the whole University of London, I was the only one really interested in taking that course. So that year, it was me showing up at Professor Rynhold's office, and that's where we would have class. Occasionally, there were some other graduate students who were auditing the course, but I was the only real student. I therefore got an unbelievable tutorship in philosophy from Professor Rynhold, who at that time was lecturer in Judaism at King's College London. Today, he is a world-renowned professor, and I was very fortunate to have had the opportunity to study from him. And he really opened my mind to Jewish philosophy, but also to philosophy in general. Professor Rynhold is very well versed from Aristotle till Charles Taylor, etc. This is an incredibly well-read and deep-thinking individual. I also think that Professor Rynhold is a very important voice in the Jewish community, in the Orthodox community, and in religions in general. If you talk to Dr. Rynhold, and you'll hear throughout the podcast that he doesn't really think he's doing anything else than studying philosophy and being a philosopher. But I can tell you that he is doing a lot more than that. This is a person who is deeply committed to his faith and to his practice, and at the same time is a critical thinker about the religion, and very honest without any cognitive dissonance at all about the history of the religion, the philosophy of the religion, and the rationale for it. He is a voice of reason and an example of someone who's able to think critically about the religion and at the same time be entirely congruent with how he thinks about things and how he practices, and not having to have any dissonance between these two at all. And having that voice out there as a person who is able to both live deeply in the philosophical and science-driven world, and together with that, live a very faith-based life and expound upon faith from a perspective of critical thinking and having eyes wide open. A lot of people read him, and therefore, just by his teachings, but also by his very being, has the ability to give guidance to many, many people. I know that's not what he is trying to do, but in essence, this is what he's doing. So Professor Rynhold has expounded a rationale behind the practice of Judaism. And in his book, Two Models of Jewish Philosophy, he talks about two types of rationale for the practice of Judaism. One called the priority of practice, one called the priority of theory. And I started off the conversation with Dr. Rynhold asking him to expound on these two ways in which you can formulate a rational approach to the practice of Judaism.
The genesis of it was that when I was studying philosophy, so my first degree was in philosophy, and in the UK that means 3 solid years studying philosophy and nothing else, very different from the US liberal arts approach. And I was always fascinated by the question of how you justify practices, right? How do you justify an ethical practice? And from very early on, and I think because of my Judaism, it was clear to me that in Judaism we have a practice, and practice is absolutely central, maybe even the primary definition of what we are. We coalesce around a very specific practice, but it's one that we as Jews don't actually expect anybody else to do. So you immediately have a set of practices that are, to us, seem to be in some way rational, and I'll say more about that, but or have some justification. If you're of that mindset, some people would say, no, God says so, you do it, end of story. Coming from that more Maimonidean Tamei HaMitzvot type of approach, it's something that I felt wasn't just arbitrary and crazy. It had meaning and it had some kind of rationale behind it. And yet we don't expect other people to do it, right? Obviously, there are universals that we do, but on the whole, the things that really define Judaism as such, we don't.
Yep.
So I was puzzled by that and was trying to look into how to make sense of the idea that there'd be a set of practices that could be rational, but not rational in the sense that you can or should expect there to be some universal justification for them.
Was this something that bothered you deeply? Like, in other words, like, why am I doing this if it's not rational? Or at that point?
Not really. No, it wasn't born of any kind of existential crisis, which, to be honest, I've never had that kind of crisis in terms of my own commitment to Judaism as a way of life, let's say. I had a crisis in terms of not being able to stomach the things in high school I was told I had to believe, which drove me crazy. And I was terrible in Jewish studies at school, and I was perfectly fine in everything else. And it was because of that. I was being told you have to believe X, Y, and Z. And I was like, but I don't believe that. Yet I'm perfectly happy living my Jewish life and keeping I never had an existential practical crisis. It was just, but that doesn't make sense. And what do I do if I don't believe that, but I still love being this? It was
you were brought up in Edgware.
We both were.
As was I, yeah. But I was brought up in Edgware in a very different way than you were brought up, because you were a United synagogue. You went to the Federation or the United?
We started out the United and then moved and went with you to the Federation, yeah.
So we both went to the Federation, but you were like a Fed boy, let's call it. Whereas I was like brought up Chabad, and going as a Chabadnik to the Federation. The point I'm trying to make is that I think the practice which you were exposed to was very much of a modern Orthodox practice and very congruent with the modern world. You didn't necessarily feel, if you were brought up in Stanford Hill, you may have felt about it differently. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, entirely, very probably. But I wasn't, and I was very comfortable. I was perfectly happy. But the belief thing just, and not belief in general, just the very specific things you were told. If you asked a question, you're told this is what Judaism says, now shut up, would just drive me crazy.
Well, you were Hasmonean?
Sorry, Hasmonean.
And so that I would have thought they would give you better than that, a Hasmo. But anyway, go on.
Not back then. Not back then. I would think so nowadays, but not back then. So the practical thing, I guess it was just more of a question that fascinated while I was studying philosophy. And I wondered if there was some wisdom from the Jewish tradition and approaches to Jewish practice. So when we're trying to think about the rationality of mitzvot, and doing so in a way that maybe recognizes their kind of the particularistic aspect to them. So it just fascinated me as a philosophical question that maybe Judaism could contribute to. But it wasn't really a kind of any sort of, like I say, personal struggle with them. Not really.
You have the Rambam, Maimonides, in the complex, where he has reasons for these, which there's criticism of.
Yes, and he's an exponent of what I call priority theory.
Yes,
priority theory is a very common view taken, which is basically that, and it applies beyond the realm of practice, but if you're applying it to practice, in order to do something and in order to justify one's doing of it and show that it's rational, there needs to be some kind of theoretical structure, a set of principles that justify that practice. So that's priority theory, and the Rambam has that, right? And ultimately it's a very simple theory, despite the complications in some of the details. But the basic theory is that justification for mitzvot is that it will perfect your intellect. Ultimately, there's a long story of how it does that, and that's where it's complicated. But it's a very simple theory. That's it. They're justified because right? There is this kind of principles about human nature that he would have, and the idea that the mitzvot are a means to the actualization of that human nature. And that's theory, right? That's a theory. And there are many different theories, but what all these theories have in common is the idea that in order to justify practices, you have to have some theoretical principle behind them, right? You have to understand it, and then you say, that's why it's rational.
Yeah.
And that's something that for various reasons, I have all kinds of critiques of that approach. And certainly from a universalistic perspective, it seemed to me very problematic. And I guess the easiest way to show why it's problematic, and this is an example I often use. So I taught for 7 years, I was in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at King's College London. And I was the professor of Judaism. So I'd be there and I would be teaching students who were primarily non-Jewish students. I would say 90+%.
And I've heard you say that. And then I think to myself that I was the 0.01% who was Jewish.
Yeah, I think there were 3 of you maybe, but yeah, absolutely. And if they took courses with me for 3 years and followed the Judaism track of courses, by the end of the 3 years, they would have a really good understanding of Judaism, of all kinds of things. But in all that time, not a single convert. As in, they understood it, but they didn't justify it to them. So all the theory in the world that I could give them, that's great. I now understand why you can't come into work on Yom Kippur, or why you can't come to this route. I get that, and it makes sense because of this structure. Yeah. But it didn't convince them, obviously.
It wasn't compelling to them.
Not compelling. So what's missing? If I've given all the theory and I've given all and so
did they, because you did a lot on the Rambam, right? And you explained the Rambam's view on it. You're inculcating within the person the correct piece of opinion so they can then, et cetera, and in the end, the unbiased observer, let's call them, which is your Gentile student would be, we could probably, they're very earnest people. They want to know. They're not trying to try and find fault. They want to understand it. It's not convinced that by putting on tefillin in the morning or by I am going to get the correct piece of opinion, and then I'm going to, in other words, they're not.
Absolutely. And there are 3 options there, as in, so why not? And by the way, obviously I'm being facetious. I wasn't trying to convert anybody. The point is...
but they didn't find any of these explanations compelling. And one would have thought some of them may have. Yeah, point.
More than that, if practical justification is all about theory and principles, I've taught them the theory of the principles, why don't they believe it?
Yeah, it's if intermittent fasting, right? You go and study intermittent fasting, you find that's healthy. You're likely that some people are going to do intermittent fasting.
Yeah. What are the options here? Either I'm a dreadful teacher, possible, or
I can attest that not the case.
Or they're all deeply unintelligent, which is clearly not the case.
Definitely not the case.
Or, what's the other option? And the other option to me, which is something that I build out of ultimately Jewish sources, and to be honest, yes, from the simplest source at the beginning, which is Na'aseh v'nishma, right? Which is that actually doing comes prior to understanding.
Yeah.
So we'll do it, then we'll understand. Na'aseh and then nishma. But more than that, that there is something that practice itself gives you, epistemologically speaking, that is uniquely practical and that cannot be communicated in propositional form. So by doing practice itself, that can communicate a certain, call it knowledge if you like, that is irreducibly practical, and that serves in part to ground the rationality of those practices. And there are all kinds of different ways into this, but number one, it's not unique. There are plenty of skills that all the textbook learning in the world won't give you, like riding a bike or swimming. You can't read a book on swimming and jump in the pool and you're good, right? You've got to actually train, right? You've got to actually do it. And you
don't understand the enjoyment of swimming.
So that's the second point.
Unless you actually,
So one is you can't actually do it. And number two, There are certain, this is a distinction that actually I first came across in Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue, where he talks about internal and external goods. So you can do something. The example he gives, I think, is playing chess, right? So if I play chess and I do it as a career, then I might earn money from playing chess. And that is a good external to the playing of chess. I could do anything and earn money. It so happens I play chess and earn money. But there are also internal goods to chess that you can only understand if you play chess.
Yeah.
Right? Which is just the beauty of the strategy and and seeing a move and just the joy it gives you and the beauty of it, all of these kinds of things. But you can only do that if you play chess. Somebody looking from the outside is just, well, what's that? It's nonsense. It doesn't give me anything. Practice, I believe practices in general are like that. There are goods internal to them you only gain through the practice of them.
Do you think that happens on your own, or do you think it happens in community?
No, it has to happen in communities.
Yeah.
It has to happen in communities.
So, because it's really interesting, here in New Haven, we have two communities, both Orthodox, one Beaver Hills, another one, which is an older community and has become much smaller and somewhat dying in Westville. And you have people who move to Westville and they try to be Shomer Shabbat there, but they don't have the community aspect of it. To really experience and understand why Shabbat is so valuable, you have to do it within a community that is Shomer Shabbat. If you try and do it outside, it doesn't have that same, you can explain it, but until someone's been there, they don't get, that's why they do it.
So and I think I'm just thinking in terms of people who come to a Shabbat table who maybe don't generally do that.
Yeah.
And how much they will enjoy it, love it. Doesn't mean they're going to go and do it forever, but you only get that from participating, right? Yeah. From doing it. You can't watch.
It's an immersive thing, is what I'm saying. Even if you just come from it, so you try and do it in Westville, is the example I'm giving. And there are people, but there's not enough people doing it together with you. You're not going to have that same experience as if you come to a community where everyone's immersed in it, and then something magical happens in that practice where everyone's practicing it together.
Yeah, adds to. I think you can still enjoy it in a very diverse community as long as there are a few of you doing it.
Yeah, correct.
But this is much more in terms of, I genuinely think there is a certain knowledge that is granted that only comes via practice. That's the priority of practice idea, which is that it is through practice itself that one can gain a certain understanding that one cannot gain in any other way. And that would explain, right? That's why all my students were like, this is great, it's really interesting, but they're not going to do it. And also, by the way, subsequently, this is grown into other areas for me, where I think up to a point, I believe that about religions in general, by which I mean, and again, the example that I use here is again from King's, where I had wonderful colleagues who were friends and obviously fiercely intelligent as academics in their field. But from my perspective, my prejudiced perspective, prejudiced meaning an Orthodox Jew, I would look at them, these are intelligent people, lovely, but boy, do they believe some bonkers things.
Yeah, as if we don't.
Similarly, that they would look at me, and I hope they thought he's intelligent, and I hope they thought he's my friend, but I know they thought, but man, he does some bonkers things.
Yeah, but also believes in some things which are...
Yeah. I think less so on the belief side, because for them, most of the bare things I believe are actually, we believe something like that. So I think it was less that, it was more, but he does all this weird stuff.
Oh, but you believe there's value in that. The point is, you believe there's value in that weird stuff, right? There's a belief that somehow you're...
Correct.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. But I understand why they don't have access to that. But in the same way, I don't have access, for perfectly good reasons as well, because of where I'm situated, to their devotion and belief in certain stuff that I deem to be crazy, right? But they deem my practice to be crazy, and we are both absolutely justified in believing that.
But this is where the truth things really comes out, because they can have their truth You can have your truth, and you can both feel very passionately. And I love the word conviction, right? Because in the startup world, there's this thing was trying to raise money at some point for my startup. And I would sit with VCs, and then they would say to me, I just couldn't get to conviction on your idea. And what you really wanted was that they would say, yes, I was able to get to conviction. Here's a bunch of money. But the idea is that, and I started to really think about this concept of conviction because I really like it, because I can have very strong conviction about something, especially in an early stage company. No one knows. It's a bit like religion. No one knows whether this is going to be the next big thing, but you can have conviction in it. And I think in religion, we can have a very strong conviction in my think.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that you can't have an opposite conviction and we can both be right.
Correct. Yeah. And that back then in the book that discusses all of this, I call it reasoned confidence.
Right.
So having confidence in something, and it's a reasoned, it's not based on nothing, it's reasoned, but those reasons aren't universal reasons that can translate into some theory that you can then simply explain to somebody else. So I have a reasoned confidence in Judaism. They had a reasoned confidence, in this case, it was Christianity. And both of these are indeed forms of reasoned confidence that are absolutely legitimate, but that don't translate into some sort of neutral language where we compare and contrast and say, oh, and therefore this one's better, which is a very modern idea. I think Rambam, for example, Maimonides, would genuinely believe that there's this one thing, it's called truth, and Jews have most of it, and Islam has less, and Christianity has less. But they can all be translated into that single scale. Whereas in much modern thought, and Rav Soloveitchik would be an example of this, he just doesn't believe that. You can't translate in everything to a single scale such that this one's here, this one's here, this one's here. Do we all have faith that ours is the best one, the right one, whatever you want to say? Absolutely. And that's fine, but that's faith.
Yeah. But is the word conviction, I feel like the word conviction is better than faith in some ways.
Yeah. I just use
go ahead.
I just use the word faith here because talking in religious context, that's the natural way to go, because you can have conviction in all kinds of things that aren't to do with religion. So that's the only reason I use the term. But yeah, I think it's the same. I
think faith somehow connotes something post-rational.
So I think colloquially, it is often used in that way, yes.
Okay.
I actually think that faith is something that, let me put it like this, most people, when I'm talking about those, say, for want of a better term, prejudices or biases, and not in the pejorative sense, but in the sense that we all have them.
Yeah.
Inevitably, we're all brought up in certain cultures, and that leads to us having certain predilections for certain views over others. Prejudice in that sense. And all of those ultimately are faith-based. We don't come to them because anybody ever set out an argument for us. That's just the way we live. We're convinced by it. And then maybe post facto, we can start thinking, actually, is that justified, and try and work it out or not? But therefore, there's a certain kind of pre-reasoned background that therefore isn't irrational, right? But feeds in. It's the picture of the world that we have that is not necessarily something that we can even spell out fully to ourselves, that informs the way we live our lives. It's like Charles Taylor calls it the background, or you've got Wittgenstein talks about seeing as, the idea that there's one thing and people can see it as in two different ways, and there is no fact of the matter that's going to lead to them seeing it one way and them saying, arguments for the existence of God are a very good example of this, right? There are religious people who really buy into certain arguments for the existence of God, maybe the teleological argument, right? The argument from design. And there are people who find that to be very convincing. And there are other people who look at it and say, that's not remotely convincing. There's no disagreement there on any kind of matter of fact. They all agree on the facts in terms of the way, the incredibly intricate and complex nature of our universe. Yeah, they're all up. And one person says that can't be just natural. And the other people says, how can that be anything other than natural? but they're just seeing the same thing from a different perspective. And that perspective is more a attitudinal thing, and it is a kind of result of reasoned argument.
So you bring up Charles Taylor,
Yeah.
and the modern age, which is, I think, is that his magnum opus, or at least one?
Gosh, I'm way back in Sources of the Self and earlier works of his. So.
But that he talks very much about the time of an enchanted world, and now we live in a disenchanted world.
Yes, yeah.
And what you're living, it's really interesting because you are a philosopher. Would you consider yourself You're Jewish and you're doing philosophy? I know there's conversation about whether there's such thing as Jewish philosophy or
no, I do a lot of, I would say, if people ask my specialism such as it is, it's definitely Jewish philosophy, yeah.
So you're a Jewish philosopher, not doing Jewish philosophy, in a disenchanted world, and which is very different than what Maimonides was doing.
Yeah.
Which, or even Spinoza.
Yeah.
Whereas, because we are living, as Charles Taylor kind of points out, we're living in a predominantly disenchanted world where disenchantment is the norm, rather than even Spinoza was living in a time when enchantment was the norm and there were those becoming disenchanted.
Yeah.
How do you then take these ancient ideas, and this is part of why your formulation of the priority of practice is so important, I think, as a Jewish thinker, for Jews practicing Judaism today, for them to understand that this exists, and there's a way of rationalizing this in a disenchanted world. Do you feel that this is part of like your mission, is to try and bring a Judaism which was very relevant in an enchanted world to a disenchanted world?
I don't know. I'm not sure. To be honest, I'm not sure I see what I do as mission-based in that way at all.
Well, as a Jewish philosopher, right? If you say a philosopher who's doing Judaism, that's different. But as a Jewish philosopher, right? My mom is a Jewish philosopher who's someone who's taking Judaism and explaining him in terms. There has to be some reason why one wants to do that, or maybe there's not.
No, I'm very passionate about it, and definitely it's something. I teach and I write on it, and I think one of the things that does matter to me, and it's something actually though that's got better over the last, let me think, where am I now? So in the last 25 years even, is to respect or have respect for a reasoned, and again, that's a very loaded term, but a reasoned faith-based view. And what I mean by that is, and why I say it's got better, when I was at LSE doing my PhD, I will always remember my supervisor saying that they had an admissions meeting for undergrad, and they were discussing someone, and there was one student, very strong student, but happened to be religious. I think Jewish, but might not, just religious, right? Yeah. And around that table, all these academics in the philosophy department there said, yep, definitely admit this student, excellent student. Someone said religious and said, yeah, we'll soon knock that out of her. As in, that was the attitude. And that's definitely changed, right? The kind of hostility there once was within philosophy to religion and religious believers, I think has softened, and in part due to some very prominent philosophers who are religious but whose philosophical bona fides can't be questioned and have produced really significant work.
Charles Taylor one of those? He seems
Charles Taylor, he would be one. But kind of Alvin Plantinga in a very strictly analytic mode would be also another, and not because everybody agrees or likes these people or their philosophy, but they're clearly doing something that is significant within the discipline. So the kind of, I suppose that's the area I see myself as occupying in Jewish philosophy, in terms of don't dismiss it, even if you don't believe in it, as just stupid, because it's not, right?
But it's interesting because you're coming it from the opposite direction that I've asked you about, because I believe and I think that there are a lot of people I was talking to someone who we both know, we'll mention his name on the podcast, and a younger person who's very interested in Jewish philosophy and also comes from a very, very traditional perspective. And I said to him, what's the difference between my generation, I'm in my 40s, and his generation is in his 20s? And he said, it's the internet. And I discussed this also in the podcast last week. Like, the internet has opened up so many people that you need synthesizers like you, who also people who come from a very traditional perspective, to be able to say, hey, hold on, there is a rational approach to this. You don't have to say, okay, religion is not rational. And I also want to get your take on this, which is related. I was reading the Eitz Chaim Vital.
Yeah.
Yes. And I was going to ask you, like, what do you think about Hasidic philosophy? Is that really philosophy? So let's hold that off for a second.
Okay.
But in the introduction to the Eitz Chaim, he talks about this whole idea of the mitzvot and the Talmud being a shell, so to speak. And whereas the secrets of the Torah, the Kabbalah, the Ari, the Zohar, being like the innermost of the Torah. And more or less, there's disrespect to be the wrong word, but there's no understanding of, you can't understand or appreciate, as far as he's concerned, the outer shell of the Torah without the sod, without the superficial, if you like, part of the Torah. Whereas what you're saying is, and for a lot of people, when you start reading the philosophy of the Ari, you'll start like, wow, this is Aristotelian stuff. I'm not sure I can handle this, especially someone who's trained in philosophy in any kind of way. Whereas you coming on and saying, hold on, it's not either or. There is actually this rational approach that you can take. I think it's so valuable and so much needed out there for people who are not, for philosophers to understand that religion can be rational, but for religious people to understand that religion can be rational.
Yeah, and I don't want to, like you said, deeply rational. I just think definitely it is something that's reasonable, and it's something that can be presented in a way that can be compelling to thoughtful people, but not something, going back to the whole priority of practice and perspectivist kind of thing, that can be proved from the ground up. But yeah, definitely, I think that's the case. But also to all comers, I'm not bothered whether, who it is. I just think that when the new atheists were all writing their books and getting very popular, whether it's Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, these people, sometimes some of those things I'd read, and they put forward the view that I know they're taking and I know I disagree with, but that's fine.
Yeah.
And I was fine reading it until, or up to the point where some of them would just be dismissive.
Yeah.
In terms of, if you're religious, you're just an idiot. That's the thing that drives me crazy, because it's clearly, and I remember when Jonathan Sacks was debating Dawkins, and I don't know if this was cause and effect, but there was a slight softening in his approach from what I could tell at some point after that, where he had to concede, no, you know what, there are some really intelligent people who do this, and so he still absolutely thinks it's completely nonsensical, but there was a slight softening of that, and that, I think that's important.
It's very interesting, because I think being dogmatic about anything is problematic. When I was doing my PhD in psychology, I got to know, I won't mention her name because I might not say something nice about them more. But she became somewhat of a mentor of mine, and she very prominent in the field of psychology. And I used to take long walks with her and discuss the field, etc., the research. And I remember telling her that I said to her, and she was an atheist, I said to her, you don't realize that you're just as dogmatic about your perspective of atheism as my mother is, who's very religious, Chabad, about her Judaism. You're just the mirror image of each other. You both need to learn to have some kind of tolerance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think that people just get very dogmatic about whatever they believe in. And I guess the point I'm making is, I think this voice is very important that you bring. You have this fascinating approach to the Hebrew Bible and the stories of the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, from an aesthetic perspective. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to that, and like an overview of what that is?
This initially grew more out of another classic philosophical conundrum that goes back to Maimonides, which is the whole negative theology type of approach. That how can you talk about God? Can you say anything sensible about God? And Maimonides doesn't think you can, famously. And part of me is very attracted to that, in as much as I do think that when you try to conceptualize God in the way that philosophers of religion often do, you end up tying yourself in knots. So I am wary of doing it. At the same time, that can't be the end of the story, because we're constantly using language about God. And as anybody within a religion such as Judaism, right, we do it all the time, and it can't be that these things are meaningless. So how do we deal with the problem of religious language? And this was prompted actually by a quote from Rav Soloveitchik, right? So Rav Soloveitchik has this wonderful quote in Worship of the Heart, which was a posthumously published collection on tefillah and prayer, but he did go through it for publication before he passed away. It had been through kind of one editorial stage with him, so it was pretty close to being something he was going to publish. And he says the following, I'll just bring up the quote: "Only the ascetic experience, if linked with the idea of the exalted, may bring man directly into contact with God, living, personal, intimate. Only through coming into contact with the beautiful and exalted may one apprehend God instead of comprehending him."
Versus comprehend.
Yeah, an ascetic experience. And that just got me to thinking about the relationship between God and the ascetic, and particularly where it is, other than everything else, it is obviously, right? But it is aesthetically a piece of literature, wonderful and complex and really interesting literary presentation of all these figures and of God. So I've started to think about, what is it about, let's say, fiction, right, that moves us, and trying to apply that to Tanakh in terms of God. So could it be that in the same way that you can read a work of fiction or see a movie, whatever it might be, now in those cases, very often none of it's true, right? But you become incredibly
not true in the factual sense.
Correct, not true in the factual sense. Often it reveals certain truths to us, right? Whether about love, relationships, about those things that you can't propositionally set out necessary and sufficient conditions for. And more than that, we get moved by it. People cry all the time in theaters, right? And get scared, even though you know it's not real. So it really engages us. And it
teaches us things.
And it teaches us things, right? 100%. Good literature, for example, can really change you. So seeing, and not Tanakh in general, but this is God talk, right? When we describe God, to utilize that sort of model, which is to say, in this case, we're talking about a real being, God. So it's more like a movie based on a true story. Let's put it that way, right? So there you've got real figures, and you're brought into relationship with them through accounts or descriptions or representations that are not literally true, but nonetheless have truth to them and allow you to engage and relate, right? Now, to me, taking that sort of aesthetic approach to God talk, right, allows us to get some meaning from those words without having to take them literally and therefore generate contradictions. Or how can God be this and be that, right? And also, by the way, the other thing about it is that most of our literary heroes, and this I think speaks a little bit to the modern age more maybe than to prior ages, are imperfect, morally flawed. The really interesting characters we engage with are the ones that sometimes don't always do the right thing. Like King David, or in a modern context, right? If you think about, I don't know, just pop culture represented, right? James Bond, Nobody wants to be James Bond. Nobody wants to behave like James Bond.
Just a side note, and not to get political here,
Yeah,
but when I was hearing you expound upon this, it all of a sudden dawned upon me why people love Donald Trump. Like, I'd never been able to understand it. Like, from day one, I said, this guy's a flawed character. And I'm probably politically much more conservative than I am liberal. When you expound upon this, it made sense to me all of a sudden, 1 second. He's one of these characters that people love and admire. And you can be a very religious person who morally yourself are pure and want to be, but you still admire some person who's like post-moral.
Yeah. Donald Trump, we should probably leave aside because we'll get in all kinds of stuff. But a less extreme version is exactly that, the James Bond thing, which we don't want to emulate him the way he behaved. But
sidestepped.
Yeah, absolutely. But everybody's, but he's James. There's an attraction there.
No, but you say the same thing about God.
And I think that's important, right?
God acts in an immoral way in the Hebrew Bible.
Yes.
But still, we need to be moral. And as moral people who have total moral purity, we can still admire and put on a pedestal this being which acts immorally. We want to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's important because you see, if you take all this stuff literally about God, then you do have how could God do that? If we understand it in this more aesthetic way, then it's something that, and frankly, for modern Orthodox people particularly, I think it's important because the one thing that modern Orthodoxy has often been seen as not very good at is the fear bit, the yira of God. And whether it's fear or not, obviously there's that whole debate, but certainly the kind of that you should have a bit of that with God, and that kind of representation.
He's a bit crazy and could do stuff which
brings that. It brings that. So this is something that
is that a flaw? Is that a flaw in us as humans, though?
Which
that we don't demand of our leaders, and actually, God being the ultimate leader, our Father, we don't demand of our leaders the kind of moral character that we demand of ourselves.
No, because I think we do, and we should, but accepting at the same time. But ultimately,
we admire,
and we all make mistakes.
But we admire somehow, and give a pass to these characters, these which live on their own level of morality. And bring back to Kierkegaard, for example, Fear and Trembling, where he talks about, the man of faith, and then the person who steps beyond that, the Abraham, who's able to, in some way, we admire the person who takes his son and is willing to sacrifice his son. It's standing outside of these contexts of morality, which in a sense, transcending the rules and the laws, which I think is the greatest.
Yeah, so I'd say two things. Number one, I think that we do and should demand high standards, and we don't admire them because of the things that they do that are immoral. It's just, it humanizes them. We understand they're not perfect. And then there are gradations. There are the things we can forgive them for and the things that, frankly, we can't, and think, no, actually, you're no longer fit to be a leader. I think that's fine as well.
Don't do that to God.
No, because he's God. That's the difference. The other thing here is you've moved into the literal, which is, political, but that's real, and they actually did it, and that's a problem.
But what about our religious figures? You think about Fear and Trembling. Abraham is an example of it.
Yeah, sure.
Of the idea of, and even the Rambam talks about this idea. It seems like he might talk about this idea where you can somehow transcend the mitzvot, right? You get to a level. It's there in the Kabbalah as well, where somehow you're transcending the rules because you've got to a certain level where these rules, they're too defining of you, or you're stepping outside of it, and that's what makes you a singular individual, so to speak. But something which we admire in people who can do that in some ways.
It's actually interesting because it comes back. There's in Shmone Prakim, there's where Rambam cites this, I think it's in the Gemara, I have to find it exactly, where he talks about kind of people doing things that appear to you to be a sin. Yeah. And there's this whole account of that, which is, it appears to you to be a sin because you don't get how they're understanding this, that they've transcended, and so it appears to you a sin, but it's not really because of their understanding of the needs of the situation. So there are those people who, yes, maybe can But this is obviously very dangerous at the same time. He says
Yeah.
only prophets or only the very, very highest people, otherwise everybody gives themselves a pass for acting abominably, right? So the point is that in rare occasions with exceptional individuals that we shouldn't model ourselves upon, right, they maybe can do that. And with Abraham in the Akedah, obviously, that's a prime example, but I hesitate to use that as some kind of paradigm upon which to model our own behavior, because number one, just the centuries upon centuries of variable interpretations and people struggling with that or not. There's a lot that we could say about that, and I would hesitate to use it as an example to be
subject on its own. Yeah,
exactly. It's a whole subject on its own. And yeah, and like I say, to get back to the ascetic piece, what's important is with God, it's not to be taken literally. It is ascetic, and therefore we can do that in a way that in real life we might not. So that distinguishes it from the political examples. But I think we can and should hold people responsible. And like I say, gradations. There are things that say, we're human beings, we make mistakes, and that one's not egregious. And then those where we say, oh, you can't be a leader.
But as a literary device, which is what you're saying it's used as, the reason why it works so well on us humans is because we like that person who's transcended the ethical and is a little bit, if not a lot, dangerous.
We do, from the safety of the ascetic perspective. As in, horror movies are incredibly popular and terrify us.
Yeah.
In real life, if that situation presented itself, we would run a mile. We wouldn't want to be anywhere near that. But in the safety of that ascetic setting, whole different thing. So that's very important, because what I'm saying is that this is a perspective that we can utilize to understand God talk. That also, by the way, gets us out of having to do all those interpretive gymnastics in order to say, oh no, God, really, he was right to do that. We don't need to do that anymore if we bring this ascetic, look through this ascetic lens. We no longer need to play those games. So it's actually helpful in terms of some of the incidents where we're bending over backwards to try and absolve God of doing something that, frankly, we do think is problematic.
Would this be an extension of the Mashal Malitza, Maimonides parable type thing in some kinds of ways?
Yeah, I think the reason that I wouldn't compare it to Maimonides is with Maimonides, at the bottom of the parables, or the parables are the external clothing of actual propositional truths. With God, they're not, right? I don't think you can get to a theory of God. What you can get to is a relationship with God, emotional relationship, and that's what matters here. Yeah.
I'm really grateful for your time, man. We could have, I know, gone on for much longer.
My absolute pleasure. It's been lovely to meet you again and after a gap of many years.
Yeah, intro is going to be done after we finish this conversation. But yes, you were my teacher at King's College many years ago.
Back in the day.
And introduced me to philosophy. We haven't spoken about whether Hasidic philosophy is philosophy or not, but I'm really grateful for you spending time talking to me on this podcast. And I know that the audience is going to really enjoy this as well. So thank you so much.
I hope, and thank you. No, it's been an absolute pleasure.